was wearing a beret, his fingers browned with nicotine stains from strong Gaulois tobacco, drinking copious amounts of cheap red wine in the bars of the Latin Quarter. Although he duly carried out his light tutorial duties at the École, he appears to have mixed little with the students, among whom he might have encountered Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, who are currently the top philosophy students. Instead, Beckett met James Joyce, who had published Ulysses just 6 years earlier, and already had a reputation in some circles as Ireland's finest modern writer. The brilliant and impressionable young Beckett was overwhelmed by the brilliant and manipulative Joyce, who soon had Beckett running errands and doing secretarial chores. In 1929, Beckett contributed an essay to a book celebrating Joyce's work and embarked upon a translation into French of a section from Finnegan's Wake, Joyce's work in progress. Beckett even assisted Joyce in the composition of this difficult modernistic work, taking down the author's words as he dictated. This task would result in a characteristic episode. On one occasion, when Beckett read back to Joyce the passage he had just dictated, the flow of densely elusive Joycean prose was found to include the words, "Come in," which Joyce could not remember saying. After some puzzled discussion, Joyce recalled that at one point someone had knocked on the door, and he must have replied, "Come in." This amused Joyce so much that he decided to leave Beckett's copy intact. Such accidents fell easily into the prose of Finnegan's Wake. "Not a sound falling. Lispen. No wind, no word. Only a leaf, just a leaf and the leaves. The woods are fond always, as were we their babes in, and robins in crews so. It is for me goold and wending, unless— Away, rise up, man of the hoofs, ye have slept so long, or is it only so, misleems?" At the time this was the pinnacle of modernistic prose. The young, over-intellectual Beckett was entranced by its richness of literary allusion. Here was something he could not fail to admire, something that perhaps one day he might seek to emulate. Despite his shyness, Beckett was by now an attractive young man. Joyce's emotionally unstable daughter, Lucia, soon fell in love with the tall, taciturn figure who regularly called at the Joyce apartment. Beckett did his best to discourage her, but this disturbing episode appears to have contributed to her eventual mental collapse some years later. It also resulted in a brief estrangement with Joyce, though his influence on Beckett's way of thinking remained as strong as ever. Beckett now had ambitions to become a writer, and began composing poetry. It was highly allusive in the Joycean manner, with obscure references to all manner of writers in various languages. In 1930, the shipping heiress Nancy Cunard sponsored a prize for a poem of less than 100 lines on the subject of time. Beckett heard of this prize only on the evening before the deadline for entries, whereupon he stayed up till 3 a.m. writing a poem called Horoscope, based very obliquely on the life of Descartes. It opens, "What's that? An egg? By the brother's boot, it stinks fresh. Give it to Gio." The pages of notes at the end of the poem explain how Descartes liked his omelette made from eggs hatched from 8 to 10 days, that in 1640 the brother's boot refuted Aristotle in Dublin, and how Descartes passed on the easier problems in analytical geometry to his valet, Gio. Horoscope goes on like this for 98 lines, stuffed with reference yet empty of coherence, meaningful to the point of meaninglessness. This combination of conceit, erudition, obscurity, and fashionable modernity won Nancy Cunard's prize, and was duly published in book form by her Hours Press. Despite this minor success, Beckett remained a distinctly solitary individual, beset by an increasingly profound psychological bewilderment, resulting in bouts of depression and deep suffering. It was around this time that he discovered the misanthropic 19th-century German philosopher Schopenhauer, whose works are imbued with a deep pessimism. According to Schopenhauer, the world is merely representation, an illusory veil of maya, sustained by an evil will. Beckett found himself drawn to what he called Schopenhauer's intellectual justification of unhappiness. Spiritual suffering was the lot of humanity. It should be accepted as such, not dismissed as some kind of psychological failing. Later, Beckett would write that the experience of discovering Schopenhauer was like suddenly a window opened in a fog. By 1930, Beckett's time as a lecteur at the École Normale Supérieure was over, and he was forced to return to Dublin. Here he reluctantly took a post as a lecturer at his alma mater, Trinity College. By now friends had brought Beckett to the attention of a London publisher who had commissioned him to write another work on time. This was to be a critical monologue on Proust, the author of the vast 7-volume novel Remembrance of Things Past. Beckett's monograph is pervaded by Schopenhauerian gloom. There is no escape from yesterday, because yesterday has deformed us, or been deformed by us. Yet amidst his displays of erudition and his attempts to come to terms with the great French writer, Beckett manages to focus his language into a number of pithy epigrams. Reality, whether approached imaginatively or empirically, remains a surface, hermetic. For Proust, as for the painter, style is more a question of vision than of technique. More pertinently, if more obliquely, Proust also evolved into an attempt by Beckett to set down his own ideas about writing. Tragedy is not concerned with human justice. Tragedy is the statement of an expiation, but not the miserable expiation of a codified breach of a local arrangement organized by the knaves for the fools. The tragic figure represents the expiation of original sin, of the original and eternal sin, the sin of having been born. After just 4 terms of teaching at Trinity College, Beckett found that he was unable to go on. Despite his deep academic knowledge, he knew that the world of academia was not for him. To the consternation of his parents and his supportive colleagues, he resigned. He was now 26 years old, increasingly beset by depression, and virtually incapable of holding down any kind of job. His mother nagged, his father bluffly tried to snap him out of it. He began drinking heavily. His parents gave him some money, and he returned to Paris, where he began writing a novel. This would eventually become A Dream of Fair to Middling Women. Its protagonist is a character called Belacqua, named after the character in Dante's Divine Comedy, who is sent to purgatory for the sin of sloth. The novel is loosely based on various incidents in Beckett's life, and Belacqua is recognizably Beckett himself. It consists of several episodes interspersed with occasional intellectual meanderings. In the end, Beckett himself was forced to admit that the novel was a failure, though he would eventually salvage one section as a short story called Dante and the Lobster. In its depiction of Belacqua's physical decrepitude and mental inconsistency, this story contains the first inkling of some of the themes that would come to fruition in Beckett's later work. There is also the occasional glimpse of Beckett's grim, farcical humour, as for instance in His aunt was in the garden tending whatever flowers die at that time of year. In 1933, Beckett's father died, leaving him a small but regular income, just enough for him to live on. He began a period of several months wandering about Europe, travelling through Germany and France, living in cheap lodgings, mooching about various cities and visiting art galleries. In between times he wrote a number of short stories and poems. His letters to his friends reveal him by turns depressed and ebulliently defiant. His comments on the literary world that rejected his works would always tend to the latter. Critics were referred to as chartered recountants. The well-known London publisher Chatto and Windus became Chatton and Wind-up. Outwardly, he became ever more withdrawn. Beckett ended up in London, where he settled in a cheap room in Chelsea in the district appropriately known as World's End. Here he embarked upon a period of psychoanalysis, part of which involved attending, along with his psychiatrist, a lecture by Jung. During the course of the lecture, Jung explained how there is no unity to consciousness, which is capable of splitting into separate complexes, each of which can develop its own ego to the point where they speak in voices which are like the voices of definite people. At one stage, Jung compared the mind to a series of spheres, one within the other, each becoming darker, with the darkest at the very heart of the mind containing the personal and collective unconscious. When the mind relinquished its conscious autonomy, the unconscious grew in strength until it overcame the conscious mind. Then the individual became the victim of a new autonomous activity that does not start from his ego, but starts from the dark sphere. These interpretations